apologies to everyone, especially our witnesses that flown across the country to be in the room to testify and sitting in a wheelchair waiting. I just, it might, our deepest apologies. So now back to where we left off, that we will go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce, for your 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you for yielding, Madam Chair, and to this panel of witnesses for your testimony today on a long day, but an incredibly important issue. Neurodegenerative diseases devastate the lives of those diagnosed. It impacts their family members and all around them. It is critical that we are putting forward the proper set of policies that will foster the research and the development of cutting-edge therapeutics and cures that will still these diseases. We need to have that impact. My first question is for Dr. Cavazzoni. My home state of Pennsylvania has been a global pioneer in the fields of cell and gene-based therapies, which could offer incredible hope to patients with neurodegenerative diseases. Does the FDA have the necessary resources and the necessary workforce expertise to ensure timely review and approval of these new medicines for years to come?
Thank you for that question, and I will assume that you would like me to comment broadly on cell and gene therapies and not specifically for neurodegenerative diseases, although I'm certainly happy to touch on that. So this area is an area that is really exploding when it comes to research and a number of programs that are coming to FDA for review. And the review is done not by my center, but the Center of Biologics. And so certainly this is an area where we'll need to continue to be able to invest in a highly specialized workforce that will allow us to keep pace with both the volume and the scientific advances that we see in cell and gene therapy, understanding that this area is also particularly important for advancing new therapies for neurodegenerative diseases. And in order to do so, we will need resources as well as we will need to be able to recruit the right scientists and personnel and experts and be competitive with the private sector. And to this, I would like to really acknowledge the tremendous support by Congress by passing by giving us the HR Cures authorities, which is a hiring authority that really allows us to be much more speedy and competitive with the private sector in recruiting highly specialized scientists, such as the ones that we need to review applications and work with sponsors who are developing therapeutics in gene and cell therapy.
Dr. Cavazzoni, we're going to be hearing from our second panel of witnesses that the FDA has not fulfilled its commitments to provide regulatory flexibility or consider patient tolerance for risk and the life-threatening nature of diseases when making regulatory decisions about drugs to treat ALS, as outlined in the agency's September 2019 guidance for ALS clinical trials. What's your response to this?
Thank you for the question. I think it's important to differentiate the fact that we are, in fact, operating in a manner that is entirely consistent with the ALS guidance that we have put in place. When it comes to what we ask and the sponsors to do as they develop clinical trials and design clinical trials and conduct them. Now, that guidance is really about how to develop drugs for ALS. However, at the end of the day, our decisions are based on the data that are derived from those clinical trials. And sometimes
With our
the
remaining
data-
time, do you feel that guidance is necessary and is it reliable? Because I can't wait to hear the patients comment on this.
We think that that guidance is very important for developers. At the end of the day, we have to make decisions on the basis of the strength of the data that is derived from those developments and those clinical trials that may well have been designed in complete compliance and according to the guidance. However, sometimes we are disappointed by what the clinical trials give us in terms of results, and we're left with data that are sometimes either very complex to understand or sometimes insufficient for us to make the determination that the drug can be approved.
My time has expired. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for our witnesses that are here. There are numerous documents from the FDA that discuss the importance of exercising regulatory flexibility in the approval of ALS therapies. Do you know how the FDA has exercised regulatory flexibility when it comes to reviewing clinical trials with ALS?
Well, we exercise regulatory flexibility as we review the data from all life-threatening diseases, including ALS. Our ability to fully exercise regulatory flexibility within the confines of our statutory standards is, at the end of the day, is dependent on the data that is in front of us and what the clinical trial results are telling us. And so there are times when, despite the fact that we are very committed and very willing to be as flexible as we can within our standards, the data are not sufficient for us to be able to exercise the extent of regulatory flexibility that we would want to be able to do in situations such as ALS, where there is such a huge unmet medical need.
There is, but the issue that you have is we feel like it's very possible that the drug will work well in some ALS patients and not others, just kind of like chemotherapy treatments work well for some cancer patients and some others. And what the fear is that we're sometimes waiting on the FDA to have approvals, but yet the ALS patients are just saying, listen, we'll try whatever. I mean, if it's working in some patients, and even though it may not be working in all patients, the ability to try, we passed a bill for pediatrics that said the right to try, to allow pediatric cancer patients the right to try drugs that were available. And I think that's what ALS patients are wanting too.
Well, these are very important points. I think it's important to distinguish the access, the importance to provide access to investigational therapies through expanded access programs or right to try, versus the importance of being able to study drugs in controlled clinical trials in a way that would allow us to understand whether they work and whether they're sufficiently safe. And so we try to balance that need by working with sponsors to put in place clinical trials that have the best chance to be able to give us answers, including answers about subpopulations within ALS. And I recognize and I agree that this is a very heterogeneous disease, as many rare diseases are. And in parallel to that, we worked with sponsors to facilitate access to treatments through expanded access. And to that effect, obviously, we try to do everything that we can to facilitate those programs.
Well, I've visited with some of my constituents that have responded well to some of the ALS treatments that they have participated with clinical trials. And then, of course, someone would love the opportunity to do that. And I just wonder if the FDA is doing other things to ensure that treatments that are available to patients that they've seen some success with are available to other patients that would like to try it. Because I know we've had several reach out to us and say, hey, we've spoke to constituent A, And they responded well in this trial, but we've tried to get involved in the trial and we're being denied. And I'm just wondering if the FDA could be more flexible on that.
Well, we try to be as flexible as we can within our authorities. So, for instance, we work with sponsors and we encourage them to have open label extensions in their clinical trials after the controlled phase of the trial has ended, so that all patients can move into that open label extension and have access to the drug. And we also encourage sponsors to make the drug available through expanded access after the trial is completed, or even only after the controlled phase, the placebo-controlled phase of the trial is completed. Ultimately, we need the sponsors to be willing to work with us, and obviously we engage them regularly on these matters, because we really understand the tremendous urgency and unmet medical need.
All right. Well, I'm out of time. If Congress, if we can be helpful to you in any way, if there's any barriers that's in the place that's keeping you from going to do that, please let us know. With that, I'll yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. The chair is now pleased to recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased to be here, and this is an important hearing. I think you're going to hear in my questions a theme that we've heard throughout the day. I'd like to start with Dr. Cavazzoni. My colleagues and constituents back home often communicate to me that the FDA needs to be less risk adverse, and they cite the inability to access investigatorial treatments under expanded access and a right to try as one reason why. Now, I have here in my notes, without undermining patient safety, but I'm going to put a big asterisk by that, because our patients are not exactly worried about their safety, right? They're worried about living. And so with that in mind, is there more that Congress can do to make the FDA and pharmaceutical community more comfortable offering these drugs to patients under expanded access and right to try? It feels to me like there's some hesitancy because the patients might not always be in the best health. They may not be the best clinical pick, but they're denied a potential for something life-saving because of this risk-adverse nature. So my question to you is, what can Congress do to add to the comfort level of both the FDA and the pharmaceutical companies so they're more willing to take more risk? Dr. Cavazzoni, that's to you.
My apology, Congressman.
Okay.
I did not unmute myself.
I understand.
When it comes to clinical trials, we work with sponsors to design clinical trials that have the best chance of
So I'm gonna
developing.
cut you off, Doctor, and I don't mean to do that, but we have limited time. That's really not my question. My question is, these people are desperate for an opportunity to try something, and there is an aversion to risk on both of, and understand that aversion, right? I mean, that's natural. I mean, their reputations are at stake. The reputation of the FDA is at stake. How do we protect, as Congress, how do we protect them so they're more willing to take risk?
What I would like to make the point that, in fact, every day when we work with sponsors and with clinical trials for drugs for ALS, we take into consideration the fact that there is a much higher tolerance for risk in people who are afflicted by this disease. And we take that into consideration as we review the data. So, for instance, we do have a higher threshold when it comes to safety. We also are open and have, in many instances, accepted less safety information that we would normally
So
accept
once
for
again,
diseases.
and I just have so much I want to ask you. Please excuse me for interrupting you. I really would like you to go back and consider that question because I just know that your nature, the nature of doctors, is to not take risk, and I think we need a different paradigm here as we look at this. Let me ask you again, and perhaps any of the witnesses that would like to answer this. I've noticed and been touched by, almost without exception, all my colleagues who've asked questions today know somebody back home, a family member, a neighbor that's afflicted either by ALS or Down syndrome or MS. Of course, I'm no different. ALS has ravaged my neighborhood, and I currently have a very, very good friend suffering from ALS. He's been fortunate because of some of his resources. He's been able to travel worldwide to receive some of these treatments. So many are not. He frequently discusses how patients are unable to receive many treatments under right to try that are under clinical investigation, for which he can, if he's willing to travel and spend more than the average person is able to do, access. I get it. The complexity of treating certain diseases can be a challenge, especially to ensure sufficient trials participation. Additionally, it's hard to predict how individuals may react to an experimental drug. Is there more we should consider doing to get patients into clinical trials without undermining the integrity of the trials and harming patients? And I'm referring specifically to Congress, right? I know that you're doing your job. What can we do to expedite this?
I think that having having a greater push when it comes to understanding the biology of disease will be very important in advancing the therapies for ALS. Continuing to support us as we continue to focus on expanding the eligibility criteria for clinical trials will be very important, because we want to have as many patients as possible being able to access clinical trials, and also continuing to support us in our efforts to engage with sponsors to make drugs through expanded access more available to patients.
Doctor, I'm going
be very important.
to lose my time. I want to make one point, and that is something that you brought up, which is the cause. We spent a lot of time, and we've talked a lot of time today about treatment, but I'm not convinced that we exactly know the cause, if it's environmental, if it's not environmental, and I'd just like to emphasize how important that your work is in that area. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair is now pleased to recognize the gentlewoman from Delaware, Ms. Blunt Rochester, for 5 minutes of her questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Guthrie, and thank you to the distinguished panel before us today on neurodegenerative diseases. As was said by Mr. Curtis, almost all of us in this hearing has been personally touched. I lost a friend and also a loved one to ALS, had a grandmother and great-grandmother who suffered from dementia, and recently a longtime neighbor who died from Alzheimer's disease. And I've seen firsthand the devastating impacts these diseases have on our loved ones and the toll that they take on our working families. As you all have noted, Black Americans are about 2 times more likely, and Latinos 1.5 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's than non-Latino white Americans. At the rate we're going, by 2030, nearly 40% of all Americans living with Alzheimer's will be Latino or Black. Black and Latino Americans living with dementia are also less likely to receive a timely diagnosis, more likely to report experiencing racial discrimination along their patient journeys, and less likely to be enrolled in cutting-edge Alzheimer's and brain health research. I want to highlight this last point because I think it's important. Latino and Black Americans make up less than 10% of all clinical trial participants in active Alzheimer's research. And as I just mentioned, in less than 10 years, 40% of Americans living with Alzheimer's will be Latino or Black. This is why I introduced a bipartisan bill with my colleague, Congresswoman Herrera Butler, H.R. 3085, the ENACT Act, to increase the participation of these underrepresented populations in Alzheimer's and other dementia clinical trials by expanding education and outreach to these populations, encouraging the diversity of clinical trial staff, and reducing participation burden. Dr. Hodes, I'm grateful for the technical assistance that your team has provided on my bill, the ENACT Act, and I look forward to our continued collaboration. As you know, the National Institute of Aging currently funds 31 Alzheimer's disease research centers at major medical institutions across the United States. However, an analysis has shown that the geographic distribution of the nation's 31 federally funded ADRCs skews toward the most wealthy neighborhoods. Would you agree with that characterization?
Well, let me agree with the extreme importance of what you've said about including diverse populations in our trials and doing what we can to make that happen. And the location and sites for the trials is critically important. I agree. I'd mentioned earlier in this hearing that even at the gross level, we found the states, large regions where we did not have Alzheimer's centers, and have corrected that with the addition of 4 states in this past year to try to extend. You're right, because the academic research centers are often situated in major cities. This leads to the unintended but serious consequence of limiting those people who have direct access to the studies there. We're working very hard to get around that, and newer technologies are helping. For example, remote contact with individuals for assessment of cognition. Looking forward to the day when we can replace the kind of PET scans, which have to be done at centers which can make the radioisotopes, with blood tests, which will allow us to extend what we do, putting registries in place we track for every study, not just by an annual report, but essentially real time, how many people recruit in each study, what their demographics are, and rapidly turn around to correct things if those are not living up to standards. But with your help as well, increasing the visibility in communities to help us in recruiting the studies, individuals who are who mirror the population, including those, as you noticed, who are at the highest risk of all. Grossly unsatisfactory currently. These are among the things we're doing with help of you and others to help make this difference in the immediate future.
Yeah. One of the things that our bill would do is actually increase the number of ADRCs in areas with higher concentrations at places like historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, tribal colleges, and other underrepresented populations. And so further, our bill would provide funding so that the new research centers could establish and operate diagnostic and treatment clinics, which we believe are important. Do you believe that funded research centers with clinics in areas with higher concentrations of minority groups could help them to better connect with diverse population and enhance recruitment?
We certainly are looking to do just that, to have more local contact with individuals, more local access to research studies and trials. Absolutely.
My last question, I've run out of time. We will follow up with you, but I wanted to ask specifically about how we can improve engagement with underrepresented populations in research and some of the things that you believe are necessary to do that. So we will follow up with you in writing. And thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair is now pleased to recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for his 5 minutes of questions. Can hear
Sorry
you.
about that.
You can proceed, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Cavazzoni, for being here with us. I want to ask you, when you make determinations on drug approvals and emergency authorizations, would you ever use data or studies that have been rejected in peer review?
If I understand your question correctly, you're referring to peer review in clinical journals. When we look at the data and the consideration about approval, we look at the totality of the data that is presented to us. And so we don't necessarily exclude data on the basis of where they were published or whether they were published. The data are provided to us by the sponsor, and we also look at everything else that that we can find in the public arena, including published journals.
I mean, this isn't a trick question, honestly. I don't think the FDA has relied on large decisions and relied on a single study that's been rejected in peer review, right? I doubt the FDA has done that. It's not a trick question.
Oh, and I don't take it as such, Congressman. I cannot think of an instance where this may or may not have played out in our deliberation. The point that I was trying to make is that we look at all of the data that is presented to us, and whether it has been published or not.
Let me move on. I got to make a point because it's big in current events right now. The CDC is using a study that was rejected in peer review and trying to justify their new mandates. The CDC cited a study that was rejected and only included symptomatic patients and evaluated a vaccine, AstraZeneca, that is not allowed for use in the US. The FDA, where you come from, has supported data that shows that the COVID vaccines that we approve here in the United States prevent transmission and are effective against the Delta variant. Is that still true? And you're from the FDA, and so that's, you're the only person we have here, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I didn't come prepared to speak to vaccines today, and we have a whole center that is focusing on that. This is very much in the public sphere. You've had conversations about this with CBER, right? I would be very happy to have our colleagues at CBER and vaccine experts follow up with you and answer your questions in writing. I would prefer to have the experts address your very important question.
You're a physician from the FDA. I consider you an expert. Let's move on. The FDA is also responsible for moving forward with incredible innovative work, especially from our biotech community in Houston. And amongst these innovators are stem cell therapies. And I think that's that's pretty relevant for the current conversation about neurodegenerative diseases. And we've seen in specific cases in Houston where we've been able to move regenerative stem therapies under the RMAT pathway laid out by Cures, passed by this committee. We're finding that the work is being stymied by some of the unintended regulatory burdens surrounding the current RMAT pathway. And I understand that you don't manage that division directly, but since I have you, don't you think, can you at least say this, that autologous stem cell treatments can provide a significant therapeutic benefit?
The stem cell treatments are part of an array of potential therapeutic modalities, and ultimately whether they can be helpful or not depends on the data that is generated by the clinical trials and the studies that look at these therapies. And so I certainly do not.
One kind of philosophical, I know you're going to hedge, I got it. One philosophical question that I think we'd really like to address here is the purpose, the mandate, the purpose of the FDA. Is it focused on safety? I think you can standardize safety pretty well. I think the FDA focuses on that pretty well. But are you doing that? But are you also focusing on efficacy to such an extent that you can't really standardize it? With something like stem cell therapy, which is very clearly safe, is the FDA getting in the way of it, trying to standardize the efficacy of it in a very unreasonable way? Was it worth looking at a paradigm shift on that?
When it comes to diseases with unmet medical needs, we take an approach where we want to be as flexible as possible, understanding that there is a higher tolerance for safety. And we also, as in situations like when we use accelerated approval, for instance, we also accept when in the appropriate instances the fact that there may be some residual uncertainty about efficacy. And this is actually an inherent element of the accelerated approval pathway, which we have used in many situations and for unmet medical needs, such as, for instance, oncology, rare diseases, and infectious diseases.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair is pleased to recognize the gentlewoman from Washington State, Dr. Schreier, for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much to the panelists for coming today and also for your patience with our crazy schedule today. Neurologic diseases impact our communities and our families, and I am so glad to know, relieved to know that so much research is happening in our institutions to find cures and treatments for these sometimes really devastating diseases. My state of Washington also houses some research powerhouses in this space from what we call ICE Cream, the Institute for Stem Cell Regenerative Medicine at the University of Washington, working on stem cells and neurologic disorders, to the Paul Allen Institute, which was just awarded a $40 million NIH grant to define the human brain's vulnerability to aging and degeneration at the cellular level in partnership with UW and Kaiser. Now, this week, I read an NPR article highlighting some similarities between long COVID symptoms and those of early Alzheimer's, and raising the question about whether there could be a common pathway. For example, genetic studies evidently are showing that some of the same genes that increase a person's risk for getting severe COVID-19 are also associated with an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's. And this is incredibly scary, partly because long COVID affects young people, including children, and also because we're already seeing this explosion of Alzheimer's case in the baby boomer generation, and to add to that would just be devastating for patients and families. So, Dr. Koroshetz, I was wondering if you could tell me if we know, anything more about this. Can you enlighten us a little bit with any more research into this space and maybe applicability for children, and whether we see these kinds of manifestation in children with long COVID?
Okay, well, it's definitely an important question, and we hope to get data coming in from what we call the RECOVER study, which Congress has appropriated funds for us to, and we're going to be studying tens of thousands of people who had COVID and try and understand what these persistent symptoms really are, including children, pregnant women, people from diverse backgrounds. So we're going to have more information. We know very little now. I would say that the cognitive problems that people with persistent symptoms have are different than what you would see in Alzheimer's disease. They're much more like what you would experience if you had the flu and you just can't think right, or you had a concussion. It's more of that kind of attention concentration issues. There is one study where they looked at the risk of dementia in millions of healthcare records, and they do see an increase that they think may be related to COVID. The question there, and Dr. Hodes may opine, is whether or not people who are having trouble, whether COVID could have tipped them in a little bit further into the dementia Alzheimer process. But I think that's still a hypothesis.
Yeah, of course. Everything about this virus is so new. Thank you for that. And rather than hypothesizing, I'm going to hop, just because of timing, to my next question. I'm going to pivot again to children. As a pediatrician, I interface most often in the neurologic space with autism and with seizure disorders. And I was just wondering, I will give this to you as well, Dr. Koroshetz, if you could just touch on the state of research into pediatric neurologic diseases, specifically etiologies, causes of autism, if we have any more information there, and also any new treatments for epilepsy.
Right. Well, I guess a lot to unpack there, but I would say that what we've learned from the large genetic studies is that there's an overlap between autism and epilepsy very commonly, and also with developmental delay. And so that is getting at kind of what are the problems that occur as the brain is developing in a young child or even in a fetus. And we have some clues, and the question is how to go from those genetic clues to treatments. I would say in the epilepsy space, there are some very new genomic techniques that are now coming out, because we know what the different mutations are, and they're very mutation specific. So we're very hopeful that more precise therapies will help, especially these young children with severe epilepsy and mental disorders, cognitive disorders.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions. Thank you for your research, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair is now pleased to recognize the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for 5 minutes of questions, followed by our very patient waiver on, Ms. Schakowsky, and then we will go, thankfully, to the next panel. So, Congresswoman Lesko, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Koroshetz, has NIH ever used federal funds to pay for non-FDA approved medicines for individuals not in a clinical trial? If so, under what conditions, and who or what agency made these decisions? Has NIH ever used federal funds to pay for non-FDA approved medicines for individuals not in a clinical trial?
I do not think so, no.
Thank you. Another question for you, sir, is if an expanded access program were available and the medicine purchased with federal funds, what kind of program would have to be created to make it a fair program in terms of who benefits?
Well, that's a tricky question because I think we're talking about drugs that have not been proven to benefit. As has been mentioned, there's a great need for patients who are suffering with these deadly disorders to try something. And so I think that the benefit there would be to have them feel as though they're getting access to things that might help, even though the chances are slim. I think that the issues there are that they could be so slim that they're either zero or harmful. And I think we also have to consider the fact that the treatments that we've been seeing, I would say, are not, powerhouses. And so what we want is multiple shots on goal. We want multiple different things to be tried. And so we need patients who would enroll in these new trials. The ones we've seen so far just are not that impressive.
Thank you, Doctor. And my next question is for Dr. Cavazzoni. Sorry if I say your name wrong. This is many people seem to be surprised by the FDA's approval of Aduhelm, considering that the recommendations from the advisory panel were not really robustly in favor. And so my question is, can you walk me through why the treatment was approved?
Thank you for the question. First, let me state that we greatly value the input from all our advisory committees, including the input that we received from the Neurology Advisory Committee related to aducanumab. So we looked at the data from this program over many, many months, and after exhaustive and detailed review of the data that was provided in the application over the course of these many months, we had a discussion within FDA with experts and also took very careful stock of what we heard from the advisory committee. And putting all of that together, we concluded that the data fully met the criteria for accelerated approval, which is an expedited approval pathway that Congress gave us in 1992 and has been used successfully over the past 30 years to bring therapies faster for conditions where there is unmet medical need, such as oncology, infectious diseases, and some rare diseases. The accelerated approval pathway has not been used as extensively when it comes in neurodegenerative diseases. In this case, in the case of aducanumab, the data really made us very comfortable that all the criteria for accelerated approval had been met. And we view this as an incremental step, not only for Alzheimer's and for bringing a potentially beneficial treatment for Alzheimer's, but also an incremental step in finding ways to leverage the expedited pathways that we have at FDA to bring therapies for neurodegenerative diseases faster for patients who are desperately needing them.
Thank you, Doctor. My time is almost out, and so I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Maybe I should know a heck of a lot more about this, but I'm struck by the irony of the conditions under which the Alzheimer's drug was approved, understanding that it had limited help to patients, which is one of the reasons that we're having the hearing today to try and, to examine what FDA is doing and bring about the same kind of limited hope, but yet it is hope and it is help for the ALS community. So I just pose that because I can't help but think that there's an irony here. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, who's constituent has been in the hearing room since we opened the doors at 11 o'clock this morning and traveled across the country, except he's been waiting in a wheelchair. So the gentlewoman is recognized. She's waving on to the subcommittee, as she has many times before. Always welcome here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Cavazzoni, some time ago, one of my oldest and longest-term friends, dear friend, made a decision to set a date to end his life. He moved to Canada. He had ALS, and he made a decision that was representative of having no hope. He chose death. Well, you, Dr. Cavazzoni, have brought, through the wonders of science, some hope to people, a person in this room, because of this decision that was made. The 2019 FDA guidance, there is some hope now. But my understanding is that when I ask you to produce the name, the individual who has actually been able to benefit from this 2019 guidance, that there really isn't anybody that has been able to access that so far. That there are people all over this country who there is this glimmer of hope, but it is still out of reach. If I sound upset because my constituents are here, I have been getting calls from their friends all over the country who are begging for a bit of hope. You're going to hear them, and I hope you will stay to hear them. I know that, once we move to the next panel, you can leave, but I really beg you to stay and listen to their testimony. Could you tell me the people who have actually been able to benefit? Because my understanding that it has been quite impossible to be able to access the two drugs. There are two drugs that are there now. And maybe my friend Art would have been here to benefit from that. Can you answer me? Are there people you can tell us, give us a list of names?
So first, I really want to say how sorry I am to hear about the story of your friend, and it's really tragic. And I really empathize with the suffering that people with ALS have to go through every day. I cannot mention. I don't have the names of people with ALS who may
a number.
have been in
How many? How many? Other people?
I'm sorry, I don't have that information with me. I would like to address your point about the guidance. The guidance is critically important because it provides advice for developers so that they can put in place clinical trials and development programs that have the best chance to provide.
No, this is now beyond. Isn't my guide? Excuse me. The guidance is about flexibility, and what I'm not understanding is when you have people who actually could help advance the science. This is one contribution they could make, whether or not it extends their lives. Why we wouldn't do this? Because the option is death. And it's in your power. I mean, what a blessing that is. It is in your power. And so I'm begging you, I guess, I am, to give some hope that there will be some accessibility due to this flexibility in the guidance. Is there any more that you can do?
I really hear you, and I can tell you that we're working every day to find ways to accelerate the development of therapies and to be as flexible as we can in how we work with sponsors, how we help them put in place clinical trials, and also as flexible as we can in how we look at the data that is derived from those clinical trials, understanding that when we are dealing with diseases such as ALS, there has to be a higher threshold for risk and also greater tolerance for some residual
Well, I don't know what,
uncertainty
then
around
I don't know,
benefit.
and I know my time is up. I don't know what flexibility is then, when people are standing by, willing to contribute to the science and make discoveries that could help others and perhaps extend their lives. So I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. This concludes our first panel, and Dr. Hodis, Dr. Korishes, and Dr. Cavazzoni, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for the work that you're engaged in. You obviously heard a lot of frustration and very direct questions from members today. We have an enormous challenge together. As I said in my opening statement, I believe that we can not only make progress, but as we're making progress, that we bring hope to the patient population who are in dire need of hope. Members will be submitting written questions to you. We ask that you answer them in a timely way. And again, we thank you for being with us. Now, we will hear from a second panel of witnesses today, Dr. Carter Esham, the Executive Vice President of Emerging Companies and Senior Vice President of Science and Regulatory Affairs at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. We all know it by the short name of BIO. It's really an honor to have Dr. Merit Sudkovich. She's the director of the Sean M. Healy and AMG Center for ALS, as well as the chief of the neurology department at Massachusetts General Hospital, and the Julian Dorn Professor of Neurology at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Jinsey Andrews is the Director of Neuromuscular Clinical Trials at the Neurological Institute of New York and the Associate Professor of Neurology at Columbia University, Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. And thank you, Dr. Andrews, for traveling to Washington, D.C. to testify in person. And last but certainly not least, what? Oh, I see. Yeah. Oh, I have another page. Mr. Brian Wallach and Sandra Bravia are the co-founders of IMALAS. Thank you, Brian and Sandra, for traveling to Washington, D.C. to testify before our committee. Ms. Yvonne Lottie is a journalist and college professor at NYU, as well as a caregiver to her mother, Ramona Lottie, who has advanced Alzheimer's disease. And Ms. Kala Booth is a Huntington's disease patient and caregiver. She's also a constituent of the ranking member of our subcommittee, Mr. Guthrie. And now I will recognize Mr. Guthrie to offer a few words of introduction.
Thank you. It's great to have Kayla here from Cecilia, Kentucky. Kayla Booth. I talked about earlier in my opening statement, which seems like such a long time ago, but so I've kind of told your story, Kayla, if you weren't able to listen, and look forward to hearing it from your own words and appreciate your courage in being here today. And also, we have another Kentuckian, Dr. Isham, who I think I found out earlier went to high school with Thomas Massey in Vanceburg. So welcome as well. Two good Kentuckians here today and some other wonderful people, so thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Whoops. The gentleman yields back. I'm going to go first to Dr. Sudkovich because she has to leave us. And I thank you for your willingness to testify, for saying yes to me when I called you. It's an honor, and I'm sorry that the day has dragged on the way it has, something out of our control, but we wanted to complete our work today, and thank you for staying with us. You're recognized for your 5 minutes of testimony, and thank you again.
Thank
need
you,
to
Madam.
Unmute. Mhm.
I have unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the House Subcommittee for inviting me to testify today. Since 1994, I've cared for thousands of families living with ALS. As a clinical trialist, I designed and led many ALS trials, including the recent trials of AMX 0035 and Neurone. I'm grateful for longstanding support from both the NIH and the FDA for my research. We are at a major therapeutic turning point in ALS. There have been huge advances in understanding the underlying biology of ALS, and this has led directly to several exciting drug targets and positive phase 2 and 3 trial results in people. Yet patients can't get access to these treatments. We must act now to be both global leaders in the science and therapy development, but we also must be global leaders in regulatory approaches by the FDA to help all those living with ALS today. There are 2 pieces of legislation before you, at least 2, that can define success and options for tens of thousands of people living with ALS and other serious neurodegenerative disorders. I beg you and ask you to approve them. The first is the Act for ALS, which will support expanded access to ALS investigational therapies for people with ALS who do not qualify for trials. More than half of the people with ALS do not qualify for trials. At the Healy Center for ALS at Mass General, we have 130 of our patients receiving 9 different treatments in expanded access. These patients were not eligible for any trials. This was their only option. EAPs can be designed to also learn about ALS. For example, in one of our EAPs, we learned how to best dose the treatment using biomarkers. In another, we found that people's breathing was getting better. One person noted that they could swim in a pool again. Another person found that they could be off their mechanical ventilator for a few more hours a day. Expanded access absolutely does not interfere with clinical trials or drug development. It can help it. The second bill is the Promising Pathway Act that would allow for conditional approval of promising treatments in phase 2 and 3. We need this faster pathway for approvals for treatments in ALS. This is already happening in other serious illnesses like cancer, and it's happening for ALS in other countries, but not in the US. This is why we're here today. Progression in ALS is dauntingly rapid. After diagnosis, median survival is 2 to 3 years. And this is getting more common. The worldwide number of people with ALS is expected to rise more than 40% in the next decade. There's an urgency to act. There was no hope before, but there is hope now. Thousands of people are studying this illness. There's 160 companies in it. We understand some of the biology. We have good targets, and we have positive treatments. This is, again, a major therapeutic turning point. We partnered with the small company Amylyx to develop the AMX 0035 drug. And we showed last year, a year ago, we published this in New England Journal of Medicine, that this drug slowed disease progression and it prolonged survival. This is a combination of 2 old drugs. We know the safety of these 2 drugs. And while this drug, AMX 0035, is under review in Canada for full approval, and it's going to be submitted to EMA in Europe for provisional approval, there's no option for provisional approval here in the United States. This means a drug developed and tested here will likely be approved elsewhere first. That's not good. We've also heard reports from people in the Neurone trial of improvements in function. We don't usually hear this. There were also some important biomarkers and better responses in people who were earlier in the disease. We need continued dialogue with the FDA on how to move those type of treatments forward. Our goal is to make sure everyone with ALS has options, whether that's in the trial or expanded access, and no one should be told there's nothing to do. We're seeing pharma companies go to other countries for their phase 1 and 2 studies. They claim that the regulations are less onerous in Canada or Australia, We're starting to see drugs approved faster in other countries. My request is that we continue to be world leaders in regulatory science and approaches to accelerate therapy in ALS and other serious disorders. We need to do that. We are the leaders in the science. Working together and creatively and flexibly, we're going to find the cures for ALS and help our patients and tens of thousands of people. Thank you.
Dr. Sudkovich, thank you for your most welcome testimony. I think the sun has gone down. Well, it's about 6:45, but listening to you made me feel like the sun was rising. So thank you for your marvelous testimony, and I think that you're going to have a lot of questions from members, a lot of feedback, and we sincerely look forward to working with you. And thank you for underscoring the legislation that you support and why and how it will help move the needle. So thank you, and I know that you need to leave. You have our lasting gratitude. Okay, so now who is next? The chair now is pleased to recognize Dr. Carter Esham. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You have 5 minutes for your testimony, and welcome.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right. Well, good evening, Chairwoman Eshoo, Ranking Member Guthrie, members of the Health Subcommittee. My name is Carter Esham, and I am the Chief Scientific Officer at BIO, and thank you for the opportunity to share our insights on the state of innovation for medicines to treat neurodegenerative diseases. We are the largest trade organization representing biotechnology companies, and our members range from entrepreneurial companies developing their first product to Fortune 500 multinational companies. We regularly publish reports to help us assess the health of the biopharmaceutical pipeline across different diseases so we can identify and remove barriers to providing next generation cures and treatments to patients and their families. I'm going to highlight 3 such analyses with a focus on neurology with the goal of providing insights to this very important conversation. In 2021, we counted 653 clinical development programs for medicines to treat neurological diseases, 43% of which are for neurodegenerative diseases. By comparison, there are 2,798 oncology clinical development programs. There have only been a total of 39 FDA approvals for neurological treatments in the last decade compared to 123 for oncology. Analysis of fiscal trends provides us with tremendous insights as to whether incentives are misaligned or there are other scientific or development barriers in any given disease area that need to be resolved. We focus most of our fiscal analyses on emerging companies as they are responsible alone or in partnership with larger biopharmaceutical companies for over 77% of the clinical development pipeline. Over the past 5 years, we've seen an increase of venture capital in neurology, setting a record of $1.7 billion in 2020, a 4-fold increase from 2012. While important, it's important to put these numbers into context. In 2020, venture capital invested $7 billion in emerging oncology companies. We have also seen a recent increase in the number of neurology companies to go public, which is an important way to generate investment dollars. There was not a single neurology company that went public in 2012. However, in the past 5 years, we've seen 18 emerging neurology companies go public. But again, to provide context, in that same time period, 75 oncology companies went public. Thus, while investment in neurological diseases is increasing, it is not at the level we would like to see or need. When we look at clinical trial success rates from 2011 to 20, we found the overall success rate across all diseases is 7.9%. Neurology clinical development programs have a 5.9% success rate. However, there are important and informative differences in success rates when you look at modalities and disease categories. For example, development programs with patient selection biomarkers have a 2-fold higher success rate. Looking quickly at Alzheimer's, a very complex, very biologically complex chronic disease, scientists have identified more than 24 genes known to correlate with increased risk of Alzheimer's. However, despite the identification of gene mutations associated with Alzheimer's, many unknowns remain. For example, there are individuals who do not have Alzheimer's-associated gene mutations that still develop the disease. Conversely, other individuals may have fibrillary tangles but do not exhibit dementia. Our 2019 report on the state of innovation for Alzheimer's found that venture capital funding of U.S. companies with lead programs in Alzheimer's was 16 times below oncology funding. The field saw 87 programs suspended from 2008 to 2019. However, this year marked the first approval of a disease-modifying drug for Alzheimer's. And we do continue to innovate. Our report identified 74 disease-modifying clinical stage Alzheimer programs in the pipeline that are using 10 different strategies involving 30 distinct molecular targets. Additionally, our analysis of the preclinical pipeline found that 23 of the 122 preclinical programs had unique targets not currently in the clinic. But to deliver on these innovations and overcome historical odds for neurodegenerative medicines, creative solutions are required. As our scientific understanding of disease evolves, so must the way we develop and review these medicines. Policies supporting patient-centric, efficient, and effective clinical development and review will encourage investments into new treatments. Additionally, continued funding of basic research to advance our understanding of the biology of neurodegenerative diseases, advance our ability to understand and to develop novel endpoints and understand how to interpret those endpoints will arm developers with new targets and approaches to attack this complex disease. Bio and its member companies view innovation as key to helping patients with neurodegenerative diseases. Advances in science, more choices for patients, and a policy environment that stimulates investment in R&D are necessary to achieve this goal. And we look forward to working with Congress to develop and advance important legislative solutions to achieve this shared goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Dr. Esham. The chair is now pleased to welcome and to recognize Dr. Andrews for your 5 minutes of testimony. And it's just so embarrassing that you've had to wait all day. We're very honored to have you here, and we apologize and we thank you, and I'm happy to finally recognize you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Eshoo and Ranking Member Guthrie and members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify on the challenges and opportunities of ALS research and development. My name is Dr. Jinsey Andrews, and I'm the Director of Neuromuscular Clinical Trials at Columbia University. I'm also a volunteer Board of Trustee member for the ALS Association. I also receive NIH funding for clinical trials, and I serve as a part-time staff physician at the James J. Peters VA Hospital, caring for veterans with ALS. My testimony today are my own personal views and not of the VA. First, I want to thank the committee for persevering through a very long day. And I'd like to also thank the members of the committee and the House for passing the Consolidated Appropriations Bill during the break between this hearings panel. The ALS community deeply appreciates this, and increasing funds to the NIH, including ARPA-H and other federal research programs, are critical for ALS and other neurodegenerative diseases. I also urge you to increase funding for the DoD ALS research program. I'm here today to ask for your help because the ALS research and development is not moving fast enough, as we heard today. The ALS community needs your help to ensure that the FDA accelerates drug development, approval, and access to effective new ALS treatments. When we all work together, we have seen the ability for regulatory flexibility and speed. Congress should urge the FDA to use their existing regulatory authority to move much more quickly on ALS drugs. Specifically, the ALS Association has urged Congress to pass the Act for ALS Act to provide increased access to experimental treatments for people with ALS while funding new research. The ALS Association has also urged Congress to increase federal funding for research, ALS research, and to develop a conditional approval pathway modeled on the successful experience of the European Union. I've cared for people with ALS and conducted clinical trials for over 15 years in both an academic and industry setting. In 2013, I attended a public hearing for ALS held by the FDA, where many people with ALS at that time shared that they're willing to take higher risks, that time is a luxury that they just don't have, and that they had limited access to experimental treatments. Many of those patients, including the ones that I cared for, have since died. Time is of the essence. People with ALS urgently need effective new treatments. The FDA should be fully funded, fully staffed, and provided the regulatory authority they need to be fast, effective, and transparent for ALS clinical trials and drug approvals. Making approval decisions about promising therapy is never easy, especially in fatal diseases. But year after year, people with ALS have shared with the FDA, with Congress, and basically anyone else who will listen, that they're willing to accept greater risks, that anything that retains function, that provides more time, is meaningful to them, and that access to new treatments, including ones prior to FDA approval, is a top priority because right now there is no cure for ALS. There are also opportunities for manufacturers to make ALS clinical trials more efficient, more impactful, and more respectful for people with ALS. That includes expanded access to experimental therapies, which is not often provided by the pharmaceutical companies that are in the ALS space, typically because they're small or they don't have resources. And in contrast, big pharma companies that may be able to provide expanded access don't invest in ALS programs until they're de-risked. All clinical trials should be accessible to people with ALS by including open-label extensions and expanded access, which, if it's designed appropriately, could collect data regarding safety and tolerability. Additionally, I'm going to emphasize what Dr. Sikovich emphasized. Providing expanded access to patients outside of a clinical trial can be accomplished without impeding the completion of a clinical trial in ALS. We have done this, and we're doing this by offering expanded access to patients who are not clinical trial eligible. We stagger the enrollment of clinical trials and offering expanded access, and clinical trial participants should be assured that they have access to the experimental therapy after they've completed their participation in the formal clinical trial. There's a perception out there that ALS is rare, but we've all shared stories today about how we have been touched by neurodegenerative diseases, so I don't have to explain much more than that. It's important for us to act now. Thousands of people with ALS are dying today and don't have options. Any one of us are at risk of developing ALS or neurodegenerative disease. Our veterans who serve this country are twice as likely to develop ALS than the general population. When someone is told they have ALS, they have a 0% chance of survival. Pancreatic cancer even has a 5% chance of survival. Let the people that get diagnosed with ALS not have to face what people with ALS are facing today, a lack of access to treatments. You have the power to change that, and especially I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to testify, and of course, thank the panel before us that were able to participate in this important hearing today. Thank you.
Dr. Andrews, thank you. I think all of us more than welcome your testimony and the clarity and the passion that you delivered it is really welcome here. Did you have any just very quickly recommendations on the legislation that is at hand and what you would say about it?
I have to agree, and I'm going to say that almost all of the ALS community agrees. As Dr. Sikovich mentioned, these bills that are on the floor can make transformational change, help preserve clinical trial integrity, and help access to experimental therapies. And actually, in those cases of access and expanded access, we can actually gain data to help understand the disease and improve our understanding of the biology for the future for more effective treatments down the line.
Thank you very much. And we ask that, I'm sure there are many members that are going to submit written questions to you, and we will look forward to hearing back on those, the questions being answered by you on a timely basis. So thank you very, very, very much. The chair is now so pleased to recognize our two guests that have been with us since the doors were unlocked this morning. You knew that it was going to be a long day. You had no idea that it was going to be all day and part of the night. We're blessed to have you. We thank you for traveling across the country. I said to you when I greeted you this morning that I thought you were both profiles in courage, and that you are. So, Mr. Wallach, welcome again, and thank you. And Ms. Bravia, it is more than an honor to have you, and we look forward to your testimony now. I wanted to add, because I don't want him to leave. He left before, and I didn't recognize our colleague, Mr. Quigley, from Illinois. He is he's the Democratic lead on the legislation that Congressman Jeff Fortenberry from Nebraska. They have worked so hard on that bill. I look forward to this committee considering it. We want to thank you for the work that you've done. And thank you for being here for the second time today. But I didn't get to introduce you and acknowledge you. You scooted out before I could say something before. At any rate, it's your 5 minutes. And if you go over time, the chair is not going to lower any gavel.
Thank you so much. Well, we would be here all night and into the morning because this is a critically important hearing and tens of thousands of ALS patients have been waiting just for this moment. And we are so grateful to be here. So Chairwoman Eshoo, Chairman Pallone, and Ranking Members McMorris, Rogers, and Guthrie, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today.
My name is Brian Walsh. I am 40 years old. I have been fighting ALS for 4 years.
I am Sandra Bravaya. I'm a caregiver. I am Brian's wife. And as you will hear today, I will be his voice. We have 2 young daughters. One turned 6 2 weeks ago, and our second daughter, she turns 4 on Saturday. Professionally, I have served as a staff member in the House, in the Senate, in a federal agency, and Brian and I together served as staff members in the White House. At the time that Brian was diagnosed, he was 37 years old, and he was an assistant United States attorney.
This is our closing argument for our lives.
This is our closing argument for our lives. As you just heard from the panel's expert ALS clinicians, we are all aligned. ALS, while currently a 100% fatal disease, is no longer hopeless. Today, there are more promising therapies that are slowing or stopping ALS in people, not in animal models, in people. So the question we all need to answer today is the one I am so tremendously grateful that so many members, perhaps a record number of members, asked in a unified voice today. How do we get the tens of thousands of ALS patients alive and dying today using the tools and the science that currently exists? Therapies that can keep patients alive, to be here to see cures. And I am excited to tell you that the answer is abundantly simple. Make the FDA act with urgency and regulatory flexibility it promised in its 2019 guidance to approve the drugs that are stalled right now. It is abundantly simple, and it is within your power. Despite what you heard from the FDA this morning, it has never historically required a biomarker to approve an ALS therapy. Instead, FDA has used 2 outcome measurements to approve ALS therapies in the past: survival length and the ALS FRS scale, which measures a patient's ability to do things like walk up the stairs or cut their own food. I think it's extremely important for this committee to know the data, the facts. I can tell you, Brian and I have done our homework. Radicava is a drug that was approved for patients in 2017, and the FDA cited that it slowed patients' progression on the ALS FRS scale. The trial for AMX35, one of the 2 drugs being stalled now, also showed that it did the same thing. It slowed progression on the ALS FRS scale. And I might add, it gave patients an average of 6.5 months longer to live when compared to the placebo. Interestingly, AMX, turns out it's headed for speedy approval in Canada and Europe, and it's based on the very same data that the FDA had a year ago. It certainly begs the question of why didn't FDA approve this a year ago. The trial for the second therapy being stalled is called NEURONE, and that trial showed that for those patients who started the trial with a score of 35 or higher on the same ALS-FRS scale and received the drug, their score at the end of the trial was 2 points higher. We heard again and again today, we need science, we need data. I am telling you what the data was. It is publicly available. For patients who entered the trial with a 35 or higher, they scored 2 points better than the placebo. You can go back and look at Radicava on the FDA website. That is the exact same type of success rate that Radicava had when it was approved in 2017, which begs the question, why has this therapy, NEURONE, which is successful for a subset of the patients in the trial, not being approved? Moreover, after that NEURONE trial, several patients have been able to access it through a small expanded access program, and a number of them have seen it halt their progression or improve their function.
Phil Green.
Phil Green is a friend of ours who can now buckle his seatbelt and take his own pills. I can tell you, Brian can't do either of those things. And we just turned 40. For a clearer explanation of expanded access than I think we were all provided with today, I would encourage you to go to fda.gov. On that site, you will see very clearly that just as Dr. Andrews articulated, in order to be eligible for expanded access, quote, on their website, patient enrollment in a clinical trial is not possible. Let me be super clear. Expanded access in no way endangers a clinical trial. Second, it was great to hear the FDA this morning say they're so supportive of expanded access for patients. If that is true, I would ask the FDA to publicly announce their support for Act for ALS, which will fund expanded access programs. As Dr. Andrews also said, again, you will see the ALS clinical community and the ALS patient community is all aligned, uniform. Expanded access is not affordable for the small biopharma companies that are currently in the ALS scene. We need the funding in Act for ALS. So if anybody in this room wants to see patients get access to expanded access, you have to do that by giving it funding. And Act for ALS is the vehicle to do so. The FDA's recent decisions are all the more shocking in light of their own September 2019 guidance, which again, I am so grateful that so many members brought up today. However, it said it would exercise flexibility and urgency, and sadly what we have seen is even less urgency and less flexibility. They have asked the two drugs I have repeatedly mentioned, AMX35 and NEURONE, to run another large placebo-controlled trial prior to any approval. That means these therapies won't be approved for 4 years. Let me remind you, when you are diagnosed with ALS, you are told you have 2 to 5 years to live. So if this won't be on the market for 4 years, every single ALS patient, including us, will be dead before having access to either therapy. Congressman Upton asked an excellent question of the FDA today. How can Congress help?
FDA cannot answer this question.
FDA did not answer that question. So we, as the patients who are dying, whose lives are on the line, we will answer it for you. 1, urge FDA to approve AMX35 today. 2, urge FDA to approve NEURONE for the over 35 subgroup today. 3, pass Act for ALS, which funds expanded access today. 4, pass the Promising Pathways Act to provide a conditional approval pathway for rapidly progressing fatal diseases, even beyond ALS. I beg of you, there are tens of thousands of patients who are watching this from their homes, wheelchair-bound, some of them on life support, watching this today. Their hope is in this hearing. Some of them have waited and postponed their decision for suicide to see this hearing. I don't think you understand what this hearing means to us. Please do not let another generation of ALS patients die in pursuit of the perfect. Please let this be the first generation to survive.
We want to live. You have the power to make that possible.
We want to live. You have the power to make that possible. Thank you, Chairman.
I think that there is a sound building across the country of applause from the entire ALS community listening to you offer your testimony and your message to this committee. We are so in debt to you. We thank you for your clarity. We thank you for your courage. Thank you for the patience that you had to exhibit today. I don't think there's let me put it this way, in a positive way, that every single member of this subcommittee is moved by what you said, and that we are determined to pursue exactly what you set out in your testimony. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, next we have Ms. Yvonne Laddie, and we welcome you and we thank you for being willing to testify. We apologize to you as well for having to spend a day and part of the night waiting to testify, but I'm really pleased to recognize you now for your 5 minutes of testimony.
Okay. Chairwoman Ishu, Ranking Member Guthrie, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to tell my family's story during today's hearing. I am a journalist and a college professor at New York University, but I sit here before you as a daughter. My mom, Ramona Laddie, a Dominican immigrant, has advanced Alzheimer's disease and lives in a nursing facility in the Bronx. She is 88, and I am her only living child. This disease is rampant in my community. In general, Latinos are 1.5 times more likely than non-Latino whites to develop Alzheimer's disease. My chances of getting the disease are also slightly elevated because my mother has it. The health issues that plague our community, high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, and stroke, make us more vulnerable. The statistics for the African American community are even worse. They are 2 times more likely to get the disease than white people. But this disease is not who my mother is, even though it has taken control of her life. My mom was born in Santo Domingo, a city on the coast of the Dominican Republic. She grew up poor. In the 8th grade, she had to drop out of school to take care of her brother so that her mother could work. My mom was a big dreamer who wanted more. So she wanted out of Santo Domingo, where she worried she'd live a life with no work, no money, and no hope. In 1950, my mom immigrated to New York. Coming to America was her dream come true. She worked in factories and went to beauty school. She met my dad, Albert, a child of Jamaican parents, at a beauty parlor in Spanish Harlem where she worked. They were married 9 months later and had 2 daughters, me and my big sister, Margie. My dad and my sister have both died, and so it has been the 2 of us for a long time. About 6 years ago, my mother started to show signs of dementia. She was losing things and was confused. Then she began to hallucinate a boy who lived on top of her refrigerator. I discovered she gave all her money away to mail-order psychics who promised her riches. We spoke every day, sometimes multiple times a day. I found myself thinking about her all the time, worried. So we turned to her doctor, who suspected dementia and referred us to a neurologist. I remember the day we went to his office in the Bronx, where Black and brown people packed the waiting room. After a series of tests, He told us dryly that she had Alzheimer's disease. He gave me some URLs, told me to Google it, and sent us on our way in less than 10 minutes. It was clear he had no time for us. He barely looked at my mom. I went home and cried. This is not uncommon in the Latino community. Despite a higher risk for Alzheimer's, Latinos and Black Americans face steep inequities in accessing a formal diagnosis. According to a recent study of Medicare beneficiaries, Black Americans and Latinos were less likely to receive a timely diagnosis when compared to non-Hispanic whites. But I was ready to fight this disease. I switched neurologists, and the new one referred her for a clinical trial to help with the hallucinations. While Latinos make up roughly 17% of the US population, they make up less than 2% of the participants currently enrolled in Alzheimer's research funded by the National Institute of Health. Clinical trial enrollment represented hope against a disease that is often seen as a death sentence. I was thrilled that she was going to be part of one and hopeful that it could help her. But it was grueling. She lived in the Bronx and I live in Philadelphia. I had to get her to New York Presbyterian Hospital in Washington Heights every week for 6 weeks. She had to visit a series of doctors and have psychological exams before the medicine was administered. We barely had enough compensation to cover an Uber from the Bronx to reach the research site. Research accessibility in communities like the Bronx is a systematic issue. According to an analysis by the University of Wisconsin, the geographic distribution of the nation's 31 federally funded Alzheimer's disease research centers, marquee research sites, skews toward the most wealthy neighborhoods. Balancing her research participation in my full-time job was another challenge. I was teaching and had to ask my coworkers to cover me so I could be at every appointment. I was able to make it work because my employer offered paid family and medical leave and flex time, but millions of Americans are not so lucky. Paid leave is an urgent health equity issue for dementia caregivers. According to a national survey of employed dementia caregivers, less than half have access to paid family and medical leave policies like me. More than half of caregivers who utilize paid family and medical leave benefits reported it resulted in better emotional well-being compared to the 23% of caregivers who didn't have access to these benefits. Having this flexibility was critical as my mother's care became more complicated. She had to take the medicine at a certain time, but she couldn't take it on her own. Plus, she only had a part-time aide, and so I had to scramble for help. It was exhausting. And in the end, she got the placebo version of the trial drug. After all that, the treatment hadn't done anything, and there was not much else they could do but wish us luck and send us on our way. Despite the initial engagement and our interest, we were never contacted again about opportunities to participate in a clinical trial. Things continued to get worse. Soon the boy above the fridge was joined by a new hallucination, ice. I would get frantic late night calls that a black ice van was circling the block around her apartment, and she would beg me to help her. They were coming to deport her, she said. I tried to tell her that they couldn't take her away. She was a naturalized citizen. Finally, her aide found her wandering in the street one morning. She was no longer safe. She needed 24-hour care, and I had to place her in a nursing home. It was the hardest thing I ever had to do in my life. So now, after living through a pandemic in which every floor of her nursing home was infected with COVID-19, and I had no physical contact with her, after a year in which my mother further declined, she is now nonverbal and can no longer feed herself. And every day I wait for the call that says she is passing. I'm asking your committee to think of her, me, and so many others like us who journey through this disease. So here's what I am respectfully asking on her behalf. Improve equity in diagnosis and detection of Alzheimer's to expand treatment and care options for families. improved equity in Alzheimer's clinical trials to deepen our understanding of the disease in high-risk communities, establish a paid family and medical leave policy to help families navigate work and medical care, support a national Alzheimer's prevention goal to give hope to families. Without the committee's action and society's commitment to brain health equity, Alzheimer's will be the last chapter in the lives of more and more Americans. It's time to change the way this story ends. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lottie. I hope you you realize how powerful your testimony has been, and that even though we kept you waiting all day, that none of that time that passed really diminished the power of your testimony and the story of your mother and you as her daughter is the story of so many Americans in our country. And I look forward to the day where the policies that you articulated that are needed are actually put into place by the Congress, because it would just serve the American people so well as they struggle. These are 24-hour struggles on a daily basis in people's lives. I had the privilege to take care of my parents, and it was a huge responsibility, and I was working, and everyone else in my family was working as well. But there were so many things that you brought up that others have that I didn't have to carry the burden of. These are huge burdens, and this is by no means, I think some people think of these services as handouts. I say, go walk in your shoes for 24 hours. So thank you for walking in your shoes into our lives today at the committee. And now I would like to recognize Ms. Kayla Booth. As I said earlier, she's a Huntington's disease patient and a caregiver. We're prepared to hear your 5 minutes of testimony. Thank you for your extraordinary patience.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to share my family story and the story of so many HD families. My name is Kayla Booth. I am 34. I am the fourth known generation in my family to have Huntington's disease, but only the second to be officially diagnosed. I am a patient, I am a caregiver, and more importantly, I am a voice. Today, I am a voice for the HD families who do not have one. Over the years, I have taught myself to emotionally disconnect. This allows me to be able to separate the Huntington's disease from the person. Twice I have watched a broken system turn a devastating situation into an almost unbearable one. Huntington's disease is a rare inherited disease that causes degeneration of the brain. It affects each patient differently. The symptoms are different, the progression time is different, but what is not different is it is fatal and there is no cure. Unlike other neurological diseases, symptoms of HD typically develop in the prime of a person's life, their 40s. These years are typically a person's highest earning income years, middle of raising families, or planning for retirement. However, HD disrupts all of that and physically, emotionally, and financially drains families. In the late 90s, early 2000s, when I should have been creating memories with my papa, I was emotionally disconnecting from him. HD had turned this previously gentle man into someone who beat my mama black and blue. Someone we always needed to keep a phone nearby in case we needed to call 911. Before HD, my papa was a man who stepped in as a father figure for my dad, a man who drove across country to wherever we were stationed. A broken system would send my papa to Central State Mental Hospital. A broken system that didn't have the ability or facilities to care for someone with HD because he could be a danger to himself and the staff. A broken system ended with my papa passing away and my mom spending 5 years in court battling to settle those bills. Fast forward to 2015, the third generation, a second path, and another interaction with a broken system. My mom, Marcia, is what you would describe as a ray of sunshine, the type of person to never say a harsh word. My mom decided when my papa was diagnosed with HD that she didn't want to be tested. She wanted to live her life to the fullest, and when it was God's time, he had a plan. My mom had hope she didn't have the disease, hope there would be a cure, but honestly, she didn't want to be a burden, and she sure didn't want to have to take an MRI. But man, if we'd only known how valuable those results would have been. November 2015, my mom's HD started manifesting as paranoia. The less she slept, the worse it got. Eventually ended up in a psychiatric ward receiving treatment for what doctors thought was schizophrenia. 30 days it took to get her home. 30 days we drove to Louisville to see her for 1 hour. 30 days I watched my dad's heart break each time we had to leave her. They didn't understand she was experiencing the progression of HD. Over the next few years, her health slowly declined. She went from being a top real estate agent in the county to needing help calculating figures. She is no longer able to drive. She is losing control of her swallowing, and she has mentally declined to childlike behaviors. So my dad and I always make sure to be nearby. November 2019, we applied for her Social Security disability income. It was declined. We appealed. It was declined. We hired a lawyer, and in March of 2021, a broken system finally awarded her SSDI and Medicare coverage. A fourth generation, a new approach. In 2018, I chose a more hands-on approach. I wanted to have all the facts and all the options. There was a fear of medical insurance finding out. There was a fear of life insurance finding out. So after I got all my affairs in line, I was able to do genetic testing off the record. The results came back. I had HD. I was tired of living in fear, and after the battles my family had faced, I decided it was time to help make a change. I now have an amazing team of doctors and nurses on the record. I participate in clinical trials, and I help with advisory boards. And I'm here to help fix a broken system. I urge Congress to take the following steps to help patients and families living with Huntington's disease. Pass the Huntington's Disease Parity Act this year. The HD Parity Act eliminates the Social Security, disability insurance, and Medicare wait periods. As you can see from my family's story, HD families often spend years securing a disability determination, then are forced to wait another 6 months to receive SSDI cash payments and 2 years for Medicare coverage is unacceptable. This policy must be changed. Expand the focus of the NNCSS to include Huntington's disease, and require the FDA and NIH to work with companies that are researching HD cures to design trials that recognize the uniqueness of HD, that the disease onset and progression is different from many other diseases. The HD community needs more research and cures as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Booth, for your important testimony. And again, on behalf of all of the members of the subcommittee, we apologize for keeping you waiting all day and into the evening, but you enriched our hearing with your testimony, and we very much appreciate it. We now have, we've completed the testimony of our witnesses in the second panel, and we'll move to member questions. And I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes to ask questions. To Dr. Andrews, as a researcher on the front lines of ALS, what do you need from Congress and the FDA to continue to innovate on clinical trial design?
I think it's very important to urge FDA to use its existing regulatory authority and abide by the 2019 FDA guidance when reviewing clinical trial results in the context of the disease that they're reviewing for. It's important to note that something like ALS that has a 0% chance of survival, if something shows a clinical benefit on retaining function and slowing disease progression and extending survival, yet is safe and well tolerated, the traditional framework that's typically used by the FDA doesn't work for a fatal degenerative disease like ALS. In doing so, this can spur innovation and interest of other pharmaceutical companies to come in the space. When we get stuck in these types of situations, it actually drives people away from that disease, and we lose that interest. So I think in that way, the two bills we talked about and urging some regulatory flexibility and abiding by the FDA guidance that was finalized in 2019 can help that process along for clinical trials.
There's something that kept coming up that the witness from the Dr. Cavazzoni kept mentioning, and that was biomarkers. And it seems to me that the FDA kind of stood on that. When we have biomarkers, we've had biomarkers in other drug development and all of that. It seems to me that the needle is stuck there. And can you cast some light on this? Because I pointed out in a comment after what was stated that it was, there seemed to be a real irony when there are results, even though they're limited, but they're desperately needed, and we don't move in that direction. But again, back to the biomarkers. Can you enlighten us on this,
Yeah, thank
please?
you for that question. It's a very good one, and it's important to understand it is true that in ALS, we don't fully understand the biology, and if we did, we could cure it today.
Exactly.
However, when we're talking about biomarkers, that's not what a patient feels or functions. We have to understand that biomarkers will develop if we continue to do clinical trials and collect serum, spinal fluid, urinary samples, and understand the biology. So that's why continuing federal funding for ALS research is critical in parallel to helping gain access to experimental therapies for those living with the disease. We can do both. You know, it's such...
This sounds like the European model to me,
So
in a way.
this is
Is
part
it?
of the reason why the Act for ALS Act can help in this situation. It's difficult for us as Americans to see potential therapies get faster review and approvals because regulatory review processes abide by different legislations. This could help harmonize us globally and keep us leaders of developing innovative therapies for these types of conditions.
Thank you very much. To Dr. Esham, how can we get more companies to participate in expanded access?
Thank you, Chairwoman, for the question. In terms of expanded access, generally speaking, you know, each clinical development program and each company do have unique and multiple factors they have to evaluate, including the ethical and resource capacities to stand up programs that include establishing rationale and criteria about how to make decisions about which requests would be granted and on which basis they would be denied. There are other factors, such as the questions around the ability, the capacity to scale up supply, as well as thinking through any impact on clinical trial enrollment. There's not a one-size-fits-all relating to each clinical development program or each company as to how they approach expanded access. And the primary goal remains to get medicines approved so that they're available to all patients. I will note just quickly, I don't want to cut time, but the requirement for companies to provide information on expanded access that was passed in Cures There may be something to think through there to make sure that more people are aware about how to find expanded access programs. So that's something maybe we can think through and work with you all on.
Thank you very much. My time has, I've exceeded my time. The chair now is pleased to recognize our wonderful ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Guthrie, for your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And Kayla, I know that when we talked earlier this week, I was talking how important it is that patients and advocates come before Congress. It is vitally important. I think people get the impression that we're up here and we're walled off. And as from the testimony of the Wallachs and Abreuas, it moves us, and it really does, hopefully will inspire most of us to act. And the most important meeting I've had in 12 years here, I can tell you, and we have, 8 or 10 a day, and the one that I could point to as my most moving was a 9 or 10-year-old. Her name was Shelby Enzer. I'll say her name. Mom's Kay Enzer. Dad was Mitch, and her brother was Tanner, and she came here as a 9 or 10-year-old with ALS. And she said, my father cannot hug me anymore, but I'm here because I want to make sure no other little girl goes through what I'm going through. And God rest his soul, wonderful, wonderful man, and just a great family. And I've always been an advocate for it because they showed up. I didn't have personal experience with ALS. Unfortunately, a lot of us have personal experience with at least one. What we're talking about today, and Alzheimer's is one that I have in my family. So it's all important. And thanks for being here and sharing your stories and making a tremendous effort to be, whether you're on Zoom or whether you came here today, the tremendous effort to be here. It's important. I'm glad you're here. So Kayla, when we talked earlier this week, you mentioned your past involvement with a hopeful clinical trial for HD and shared some exciting news of that this week. Your mother had her first appointment for a clinical trial. Can you describe the significance for you personally of having the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial and now your mother? And can you share with us some of the changes you would like to see happen to better reflect the needs of the HD patient community? Kayla, you may be on mute if you're...
Yeah, you have to unmute.
Can you hear me?
I hear you now, yes.
Being part of the clinical trial gave me purpose. It helped me find my path. I think God wants me to help others, and joining the trial put that into action. Knowing that I have HD brings a lot of challenges, and I had to make a lot of tough decisions before most people my age. However, enrolling in a clinical trial helped me see that I can help a lot of people with HD and those at risk. Families are hoping for treatments to delay the disease or even cure HD. Clinical trials give me hope. The clinical trial I was in had so much positive talk to be a breakthrough treatment to help me, my family, and so many other families. The trial didn't work out, but now my mother is enrolled in her first clinical trial. Once HD does damage to your brain, it can't be fixed. So the sooner to get treatment or cure is better. As far as what can be done, being part of the trial and working with my local Center of Excellence, I've learned that the FDA has been a good partner with the HD community and its researchers. However, I would like the FDA to think about ways it can work with the communities to recognize the difference that exists from patient to patient so that we aren't missing out on treatments that could help HD patients.
Thank you. My friend Adam Kinzinger, a member of this committee, is working on with Social Security that you talked about. And it sounds like your family had a difficult time getting your mom's disability application approved, and that it felt like the system was uninformed and didn't understand HD. How did that impact the experience with your family?
Yeah, so the disability process was very difficult and frustrating. It took 16 months to finally get my mom's application approved. She was denied 2 times, and it wasn't until we hired a lawyer that she was finally approved. Luckily, because we involved a lawyer, the judge backdated her eligibility to receive her SSDI and Medicare right away. However, I know from other HD families who cannot afford a lawyer, it takes much longer to get approved, and then the waiting periods still apply. Many individuals and families, including mine, try to support the HD patient so that they can work as long as they can and try to prolong progression, maintain income, and health insurance through their employer. So by the time that they've applied for a disability, they really need it. Making them wait years to get through the process and even longer wait times is unacceptable. HD is a devastating physically, emotionally, and financially. Not receiving the SSDI payments or access to the Medicare immediately is an added hardship that HD families should not have to endure. That is why I'm asking Congress to pass the HD Parity Act. HD families need your help. Most people have not heard of Huntington's, and even those who have don't really understand it. That was our experience with going through the SSDI process. While we learned that HD is on the Social Security Administrative Compassion Care List, it did not seem that anyone understood HD or applied compassion to my mom's case. For HD patients, their limitations may not be obvious to someone who is physically disabled. The first symptom that many HD patients experience are cognitive and behavioral. Uninformed staff and judges deny the application because they don't understand the way HD impacts a person. For people like my mom who do not want to get tested to confirm they have HD, makes the disability process even more challenging. Disability staff and judges need to be better educated about how HD to ensure patients get their disability termination quickly. I would recommend requiring the SSA to consult with HD Center of Excellence. The providers and staff at the Center of Excellence are true experts. However, even if it only takes 6 months for an HD patient to get through the SSDI process, the existing wait time still delays the Medicare coverage for 2 years and cash payments for 5 months.
Thanks, Cal. I think I've run out of time to ask questions, and thanks for answering that. I know that Representative Kinzinger appreciates your answer, and I will yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair is pleased to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for your 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Eshoo. And let me really thank everybody for testifying today. As the chairwoman said, this was really it's incredibly informative. I mean, we've heard from some of you and, in the last few months, but the testimony today really makes a difference in our understanding, I think, of where we need to go. So I just wanted to mention, obviously, there was a lot of, from patients that there has been a lot of information from patients that finding access to a clinical trial can be extremely difficult based on age cutoffs based on disease progression, other factors. And FDA has even spoken about the tension in designing trials so more people can participate while understanding the clinical benefit. In the FDA's guidance for developers of ALS treatments, the agency advised that more patients could participate in clinical trials if developers broaden the criteria, allowing for one group to be considered for a primary analysis and a broader group to be used for a secondary and supportive analysis. So I wanted to ask three of you, start with Dr. Asham. To your knowledge, Dr. Asham, how has industry responded to this guidance? Is greater guidance from the agency needed in this space?
Thank you, Chairman Pallone. I don't know that I can answer that question with specificity, but I will say in general, when you think about guidance, I know that the 2019 was welcome, as it had been some time since any guidance had been updated. And in an area like this, in such a serious and life-threatening disease, it's important to keep an iterative process that includes engagement between the regulators, the patients, the medical community, and the biopharmaceutical industry to make sure that the guidance are keeping pace with the needs and understanding of science, generally speaking. I also just quickly want to point out, I don't want to take up all your time, but as to the question of inclusion and exclusion criteria, I think there's, in addition to what you're raising in the ALS space, there's a larger conversation really looking about how we think through inclusion and exclusion criteria based on what we learned during the pandemic. And I know a lot of our member companies are really re-examining how we should be thinking through that to ensure that there's not bias. And then in terms of trial design, if we broaden that, how can we use all the modern computational tools at our disposal in today's time and in tomorrow's only to increase to really improve how we're able to analyze data across subpopulations or particularly in diseases with heterogeneity and outcomes. So there's a lot of, I think, interesting work going on, and we're certainly ready to advance all of those concepts.
Well, thank you. I want to get to Mr. Wallach and Dr. Andrews as well. Let me ask Mr. Wallach, I know your organization has done a lot of work to track available clinical trials and their exclusion criteria. How would you assess how developers are doing in implementing that portion of the guidance, and how could they do better?
I think it is fair to say that developers have taken that guidance to heart. But it takes two to tango. And FDA has not taken the guidance to heart. So what I mean by that, for the neurone trial, they had more patients. Oh, the neurone trial had more patients that were further progressed in the disease than any trial had before. And that was used against the company when they sought approval. So we need both players to be true to the guidance and implement it.
All right, thank you. Let me just, I know this time is almost gone, but Dr. Andrews, can you offer any insight into how trials could be better designed to allow for more inclusion?
Yeah, our field, actually, in collaboration with the FDA, have designed something called the platform trials, actually, which Dr. Sikovich leads, and it has broadened the inclusion-exclusion criteria to allow more patients or people living with ALS to participate in clinical trials. The issue is, I think it's true that manufacturers are trying their best to broaden the inclusion-exclusion criteria. Many of the drugs that we're testing are trying to slow down disease progression, and so often, previously, the inclusion-exclusion was very stringent to get very early onset or early stage disease, which meant that more than half of people living with ALS were not eligible. And that's what led to this kind of lack of access, and there was no other ways to gain access to experimental therapies, no expanded access, no open label extensions. And so that, I think, is changing across the field. But as Brian and Sandra mentioned, it will take, in order to design clinical trials that are more inclusive, we will have to employ technology. So there are ways to stratify populations and identify subsets of populations that you think might respond better to that particular drug. But we need the help of our regulatory colleagues to understand how to employ that in a clinical trial. The second, if there's a pre-specified subpopulation, that would be your analysis, your primary analysis. They have to accept that so that we can include a more broader population. And so there are ways to design it, but we need kind of to work together with our regulatory colleagues to ensure that that would be acceptable to them.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. The chair is pleased to recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, for your 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. Dr. Andrews, I'm going to start with you. In regard to ALS, it's supposed to be relatively rare, not as rare as Huntington's, but relatively rare, and yet I know 4 or 5 people that have had it. Is there any research that you're aware of that's going on with like a geographic outbreak? I mean, at one point in time, in about a 4 or 5 year period, I had 3 people that I knew who had, in their earlier part of their life, had all lived within probably a half mile of each other. Is there any work going on geographic outbreaks of ALS?
That's a very good question. Historically, in ALS, we have identified populations in specific geographic areas like Guam, for example, that had high rates of ALS due to environmental exposures. And over the course of study, there have been many epidemiological studies looking at environmental exposures and toxins that may increase your risk of ALS. It is actually, from the ALS Association standpoint, one of the priorities in studying risk factors, and that's why the funding to the CDC National ALS Registry is critically important to identify those clusters. One of the most important risk factors we've already identified and acknowledged is the service by our veterans. Military service increases your risk by 2 times the general population.
Is the thought today, and I know this may not be directly your area, but is the thought today that it actually causes it, or may just be a trigger for the onset of ALS?
Yeah, I think that's still yet to be determined, but there are definitely exposures that have been identified as associations.
And I'm sorry, I was talking about exposures to some kind of an environmental
Yeah, those there have been associations that have been identified and warrant further research, and that can be helped by the ALS registry.
Now I'm going to completely switch gears and go to Huntington's, but I'm going to ask you a question because it's something I think we need to be looking at, and I don't know the answer, and you probably don't either. But I'm going to ask the question because it gives me a good platform. You said in regard to ALS, if we knew what caused it, we could cure it today. If we could cure it today if we understood what caused it. With Huntington's, we know what causes it, and yet we're still not able to cure it. You got any comment on that?
Well, I can only speak to ALS as
Yes,
my
ma'am.
specialty, but as I said, ALS also has, in the minority of patients, has a genetic contributor to their disease, and there are technologies that can be targeted and deployed for genetic diseases.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Ms. Booth. Ms. Booth, if you would unmute, if I could ask you a couple of questions. If you're with me, what I want to know is the clinical trial that you were involved in and now the clinical trial that your mother's involved in, are those for drugs to treat Huntington's or some other, or is it yeah. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So it's to slow the progression down. There's nothing to treat right now, but it's to slow the progression of it down.
So you don't know of any kind of genetic work that they're doing to maybe figure out how to solve the problem? And I bring it up because one of the big successes NIH has had recently is with sickle cell, where they were able to completely change the genetic makeup in the blood cells. Now, I know Huntington's would be more complicated, but I was just wondering if you knew of any work that involved dealing with changing the gene that causes this, particularly if we can catch it before its onset.
I'm not familiar, but that doesn't mean that's not the right answer.
No, I understand. I appreciate that. I've been interested in Huntington's for some time because there was a family. Now there are 2 families that I'm aware of in my community that have Huntington's. One of whom, the first family was, I was good friends with the children of that family and knew the mother who died of Huntington's. This was all, of course, a lot of this happened before they had testing available. Your mother, who didn't want to be tested but always had a happy attitude until recently with the onset. I'm just curious if any of the data that you've seen working with the association indicates that there's a higher rate of suicide for those people who do get tested and realize they have the disease.
I think there is a higher rate of suicide because there's no cure, and there's like the only 2 medicines out there are to treat chorea. Other than that, it's other drugs treating the symptoms. So they get to the point of like the hopelessness, or it gets to the point that the deterioration of the brain is like causing mental illnesses and stuff.
Yes, ma'am.
So there is a lot higher rate of suicide in HD patients.
And my time is up, but I'm going to ask the chair just so I can tell you, just for a couple more seconds, as a result of your testimony, I have instructed my staff to sign me on to HR 2050, which is one of the requests that you made, and thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you so much.
The gentleman yields back. The chair is now pleased to recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui, for your 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you very much for convening this hearing. This has been one of the most wonderful, enlightening hearings that we've had in the Health Subcommittee. And I want to also thank the patients, the caregivers, the advocates, because your testimony here really does help us as we look to make sure that we are doing everything we can to address the diseases that are involved in what you're having to deal with every single day. And for me, I just really feel that each one of us could be involved in any way in our own families, and we know that. And to hear even the testimony of the caregivers, that is something that all of us in whatever way know that it could be something that we will be involved in with some time. So let me just say this. I'd like to follow up on an earlier discussion from the first panel on the use of patient experience data in drug development and applications to FDA. Dr. Isham, what steps do developers take to collect patient experience data, and how is that communicated to FDA?
Thank you for that question. So, as you're very aware of, as part of PDUFA 6 and 21st Century Cures, there was a tremendous effort to really set the framework to establish a systematic approach to incorporating patient experience data into the entirety of drug development and drug review. I would say we're making tremendous strides in collecting patient experience data that are on a much more regular basis provided as part of the application. That could be in terms of primary endpoints, secondary endpoints, as well as things like patient preference studies, which provide context about how to think through benefit and risk. So all of that is advancing, but we want to advance it a lot more. And so again, there is still work to be done. Another requirement was for when patient perspective data is submitted as part of the package and reviewed, the FDA is required to report on that fact. We would like to see that reporting to provide more context so that we can gain insights, not just that it was reviewed, but what impact did it have on the reviewed decision making. And that itself will help more of us understand how to develop stronger, collect the strongest possible patient perspective data to continue to inform regulatory decision making. We also want to advance the ability to put this information in the label so that it can be communicated to the patients, their families, and their physicians. So these are things that I think we still want to improve as we move forward and continue to
Could I
develop
also
more
ask you
patient-driven
that,
endpoints. Yes.
now FDA has indicated that it may consider patient experience data differently for different disease types. Do developers similarly use patient experience data differently?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I completely understand the question.
Well, the FDA has indicated they'll consider patient experience data differently for different disease types. How about the developers? Do they use patient experience data differently also?
I don't know that it's different. It probably depends on the again, if you're trying to support, say, a benefit risk decision, whereas as some of the patients on this panel have talked about the value of being able to improve quality of life through daily functions, patient perspective data would be is very important, and it will focus on that question. So I don't know that it's different as much as there might be different questions that are trying to be asked, if that makes sense.
Okay. Let me change here. Mr. Wallach, thank you for your testimony. In your testimony, you discussed your view that FDA could do more to consider patient experience in conducting a risk-benefit analysis. So what is the best way for FDA to approach this challenge, given that experiences and inputs from patients may vary?
The best way for FDA to approach patient-reported outcomes to proactively work with drug sponsors to incorporate new technologies that allow us as patients to provide information that was never available before. And that information, as Dr. Andrews mentioned, can help us understand If a therapy is helping us retain function, which is everything. So being more forward-leaning is the key here.
Well, thank you so very much, because I believe very much that the patient experience is really very, very important as we look ahead to how we may address these issues and in a more holistic way. So, Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you very much.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair is pleased to, always pleased to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, our resident pharmacist.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me begin by thanking you for being here and thanking those who have joined us on virtually for your testimony. Let me just say that your presence here, that your presence virtually, that your advocacy brings a human touch to ALS, to Huntington. And that's extremely important. I echo the remarks of my colleague, Representative Guthrie, when I say that it is important for you to be here. It is important for us to understand. As Chairwoman Eskew said, I'm a pharmacist, and I practiced pharmacy for over 32 years. And I will tell you that through research and development, I've witnessed nothing short of miracles in the way of medicine. And it's been extremely important that I continue to encourage companies and the United States government, the federal government, to invest in research and development, because, as I say, I've witnessed nothing short of miracles in the years that I've practiced pharmacy. And it is extremely important. It gives hope. It gives hope to all of us. It gives it to you. So please understand that I support you. Dr. Esham, I want to ask you, in your written testimony, you suggest that investment in therapies and cures for chronic diseases have been in decline or is low relative to the rate of disease in patients. You even report that funding for Alzheimer's therapy was 16 times lower than oncology funding, despite estimates that the disease will impact 13.8 million Americans by 2050 and cost $1 trillion annually. My colleagues across the aisle have worked to pass legislation in H.R. 3 that would upend investment in new cures due to revenue reductions from their proposed international pricing index. And the Council on Economic Advisors estimates that legislation would stop over 100 new drugs from coming to market over the next decade. Obviously, we all want to decrease prescription prices. No one more than I do, having been on the other side of the aisle and on the prescription aisle. This has been one of my primary focuses since I've been a member of Congress. But I just don't think that this is the approach we should be using. And I want to ask you, Dr. Esham, are you concerned that such revenue reductions, as I described here, would further limit new research into therapies and cures for ALS and other neurological diseases?
Yes, I think that's a fair statement. I mean, as you point out, and as my testimony points out, it is a difficult endeavor, fraught with failure and heavily rely on venture and public market investment. We are committed to working with Congress on policies to help remove or alleviate fiscal burdens to patients. But sweeping policies that create more uncertainties relating to the ability to get returns on investment for the less than 1% of the programs that actually make it to the market will unquestionably have a negative effect on future investment and impact future innovation.
And as you say, these are risky investments that these companies are making. We all understand that. Listen, I've seen drugs get all the way up to the final stage of development and then have to be pulled. And companies understand this. Look, I'm not trying to give the pharmaceutical manufacturers a free pass here. They need to do a better job with prescription pricing. But at the same time, they do play an important role, extremely important role in research and development, what they invest in that. And that's something that we have to continue to encourage. Dr. Esham, you also discussed in your testimony that the first ever disease-modifying ALS drug moved beyond phase 3 clinical trials for the first time ever this year. But unfortunately, 87 programs were suspended over the past decade. What do you attribute this long-term lack of success to, and what are the biggest barriers that we face in getting drugs to treat neurological disease approved?
Sure, and that's a complex answer, but I'll try to just hit the highlights. Again, Alzheimer's is a complex disease, and as I pointed out, there over 24 genes that we've identified now associated with Alzheimer's. I will say a lot of the failures in Alzheimer's that is different than the generality across diseases have a lot of failures in phase 1, where you're really doing like early safety studies. They're pretty much on par with during phase 2 in terms of transitioning from phase 2 and initial efficacy and safety studies to phase 3. But phase 3 is where has been the real brick wall. And so this is a really exciting time to see the first disease-modifying program get approved. And again, when you think about what accelerated approval did for cancer, it will allow us to gain further understandings, and we do think it will have a positive impact on investment. But there are other pathways, as I mentioned in my testimony, that are in the pipeline that we also have hold great promise.
Right. But research and development is extremely important. And again, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank those who are participating virtually for being here. You bring a face, you bring a voice to what otherwise is just a disease, but it's real. And it impacts real people. And we must commit to continuing research and development to come up with cures. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and I want to express not only my condolences to you, Congressman Carter, but that of all of the members of our subcommittee. Congressman Guthrie leaned over and just told me that you lost your father. So you have our sympathies, those of us that have lost a parent or both parents know how difficult it is, how very, very hard it is. Really, our lives are never the same again when we lose those that shaped us, brought us into this world and shaped us. So we hold you in our prayers and our thoughts. You're a good friend to all of us, and we really value you here, so God bless. The chair would now like to recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor, for your 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I too have learned a lot over the course of this very long day, but especially from Yvonne and Kayla and Sandra and Brian. You all are speaking on behalf of millions of other Americans who don't have the ability to be here and appear before a congressional committee. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for sharing your very personal challenges. Ms. Esham, Dr. Esham, I've read now former FDA commissioner said when it comes to expanded access that oftentimes it's the unwillingness of drug manufacturers to provide, or sometimes it's just the plain ability of the drug company to provide a certain drug. You also cited in answer to a question that it is difficult sometimes to scale up supply. You also said there are impacts on clinical trials. Does BIO have an official position on how manufacturers should approach expanded access, or is it just too divergent across diseases?
We do have principles on expanded access that largely reflect the points to consider that I outlined in my earlier answer to the question. And further, we do have a firm position that for our member companies to comply with the CURE statute to make sure that if they have an expanded access, they provide the information on their website about whether they have a program, and if they do, ensure that there is information that helps patients navigate contacting and working with the expanded access programs that are available.
Okay. Ms. Lottie, you provided a very important voice on behalf of caregivers. So thank you for that. You have a number of recommendations for the Congress: improve equity in diagnosis, improve equity in clinical trials. But we've got to do so much more for caregivers. I know that you also recommend paid medical and family leave. The United States of America is the only developed country that does not provide family medical leave. And it would just seem in this day and age, in this country, that we could support our families across America with paid family leave. I know I looked it up while we were waiting. Just over the course of COVID-19, about 865,000 women have left the workforce, 216,000 men. So boy, the burden is, we know it falls on women. They're doing double duty. But can you talk a little bit about what caregivers need today and your view of family and medical leave?
And I feel like caregivers need a lot of support. When you have a family member who comes down with any one of these horrible diseases, your whole life is completely unended. And oftentimes, like someone like me, I'm in like this sort of, I had a sandwich generation where I had kids in high school, then I have my mother, I'm still working full time. It was just really out of control. So you really need some sort of a paid leave. You need bosses who will understand that you have to take time off sometimes because things are going on at home with your mother or your father. You need doctors who are a lot more supportive. I mean, it's the one thing I learned through my mother's journey is especially with low-income people, with people of color, the doctors are not focused on something as simple as kindness. But in many cases, caregiving does fall on daughters. And oftentimes we are caught between our children and our parents. And so having a policy of paid family medical leave could make a huge difference and take off so much pressure, and also means that a lot of women wouldn't have to leave their jobs. I mean, if I didn't have the job I had, I would have had to stop working because especially when my mother was first diagnosed, it was just complete chaos with the hallucinations and I didn't know what was going on. And there were just tons and tons of appointments. So I kind of like just beg you to please help us. Help women like me, help men like me, parents like me, daughters and sons like me.
Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. A pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Curtis, for your 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I jump into my questions, a couple of observations. One is how delightful it is to be part of this discussion in which it would be hard to find a sliver of difference between Republicans and Democrats on the committee. And it's nice to be here united with all of you together tonight. The second observation is the clear difference between our two panels. And it felt a little bit like a lot of resistance in our first panel and a lot of empathy and sympathy here in our second panel. And I'd kind of like to explore that just a little bit. And maybe Dr. Andrews, if I could start with you. Like everybody else here tonight, I have a close friend that's dealing with ALS. You talk about geography. I have a particular neighborhood that seems to be plagued with ALS. And this dear friend has had access to a number of treatments because of his resources to be able to travel around the world and obtain these. And he frequently discusses how patients are unable to receive many treatments under Right to Try and expanded care. And we've talked about that a lot tonight, but I kind of want to talk to you about barriers and maybe why some of the root causes of this. And clearly, we understand the complexity, right, of these clinical trials and the needs of these pharmaceutical companies. But you mentioned price, right, as one barrier, and I think we've heard that message loud and clear. I'm curious, in your opinion, is there another barrier that we've not really talked about, which is what I would call the reputation? So if somebody enrolls in a clinical trial that is maybe further along in the disease or has other complicating issues, and their likelihood of a good outcome is less, could there be a perceived resistance to that because it's going to reflect in somehow on the reputation of their drug? And I'm wondering if there's anything Congress could do to help the pharmaceutical companies with transparency, where that data wouldn't necessarily need to be public, or is there another way that we can help them with that perhaps barrier that they might have? And is that a barrier in your mind?
I think it's important to note that some of the barriers we've already talked about heavily, mainly with resources, both financially and drug supply from the manufacturer standpoint. Both expanded access mechanism and right to try are contingent on manufacturers being able to provide the product. That's the first thing. The second, in the instance of expanded access, which is used more often than right to try, and I know right to try was meant to make things a little bit easier to access, but there are still hurdles like provision of drug, monitoring of safety at a clinical site. So there might be additional regulations within a hospital system or an academic center that requires additional paperwork through the ethics committees or the institutional review boards. Resources at the clinical site also are essential to be able to provide expanded access. Often these are not funded. If a sponsor is able to provide the investigational product, often the clinical sites don't get any reimbursement for use of facilities or use of anything.
Can I jump on you only simply because of such a limited time? So what I'm hearing from you is still resources is the single biggest barrier
very much so.
that you're seeing. I'm aware that there was some experimentation with long distance or remote trials. Is that something that we should expand further, and how big a deal is that?
I think this is a very big deal, especially for ALS and other actually neurodegenerative diseases, as you heard from the advocate with Alzheimer's disease. Access to clinical trial sites are very difficult, and so anything that we can do, and I'll name some specific issues with it because it's been highlighted during the COVID pandemic when I've had to conduct clinical trials through the pandemic with limited access to our clinical trial sites because of fear of transmission of the virus. One is trying to ship investigational product to patients. Sometimes that can be difficult across state lines if you're trying to treat people in a large catchment area. The second is issues about regulations of principal investigators or physicians who are doing the clinical trial, trying to assess safety and monitor the patients, and the patients may be across state lines. So trying to make it so that it's easier for patients to participate in clinical trials in that way. So shipping of drug across state line, practice of medicine, and research.
Okay, as so quickly happens, I'm out of time. Madam Chairman, thank you. I yield, and thank you very much for the answers.
The gentleman yields back. The chair is delighted to recognize the gentlewoman, and that she is from Delaware, Ms. Blunt Rochester.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. First, I want to say thank you all for your patience. It's been a very harrowing day here, but it was really important for me to be present, and I am so grateful. I'm so thankful for you taking the time and sharing. And I think it was Kayla, and then I heard Mr. Carter, and I heard Ms. Castor use the word voice, that you are the voice of millions. And as I sat here, I recalled losing my father-in-law to ALS, and we didn't even know for months what was wrong with him. And it just really reminds me how important our work in a bipartisan way is to the American people and to the families. And so I also want to thank Ms. Laddie as she talked about her mother. I thought about my mother and how it was her mother who had dementia and her mother's mother who would wander, and just the challenges watching my great-grandmother. And I wanted to stay. I had a few questions of which I can submit in writing, but I wanted you to know how grateful we are for you standing up and speaking out. And I thank my colleagues as well for their leadership on these issues. Ms. Laddie, you mentioned in your testimony, you mentioned the bill that I led, the ENACT Act, which is really about expanding clinical trials for Alzheimer's. And I was hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit about how we can, first of all, were there provisions in my bill that would have helped your situation, and how can we strengthen engagement with communities of color and working families to make sure that there's an interest in research and clinical trials? That's my question to you, and I'll start there.
I don't think there's been much of an emphasis or energy in reaching out to Latino and Black communities, explaining that there's help. There's not a lot of compassion. It's a lot of lots of people in waiting rooms. You get moved into a doctor who doesn't care about you, gives you the diagnosis, and then your relatives take care of you until you die. I mean, that is what I saw. And I think that it's really, really important to start thinking about how you communicate with these communities, what kind of messaging, what kind of pamphlets, what kind of websites, handouts, posters, to make the community feel safe and make them feel that there's hope. Because that was the one thing that I saw, that just no one seemed to care. I mean, the only reason I got as far with my mom is because, you know, thanks to my mom, I got a college education and I learned to advocate for myself and for her. But if I was not me, we never would have gotten into a clinical trial. We never would have changed neurologists, and God only knows what would have happened to my mom. You know, the journey's already really bad. It would have been worse.
Thank you.
So I think messaging, and reaching out to the community is really important.
Thank you. And also, I know the barrier as well in terms of where the research is done and making sure that we break down some of those barriers. I also, when I think Kayla was speaking about Social Security disability, I think today or yesterday was intern day. And I recalled I was the intern for our current senator in 1988. And I went on to be a caseworker working on Social Security disability. And this is maybe a commercial for families, that our offices have caseworkers that can help navigate Social Security disability. That was one of my jobs, and especially for those who might not have the resources. That's a commercial. And then Dr. Andrews, I was also curious about your mentioning COVID and the impact of COVID, and specifically the two things that you talked about, whether those issues are in terms of going across state lines, maybe we can follow up with you afterwards, and whether those are state or federal problems that are barriers. We'd love to follow up with you afterwards. I want to end by saying thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman, again, for your leadership and making this not just about data, which is important, science is important, but people are more important. So thank you all. Thank you very much. And I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Thank you for your beautiful remarks. It is, again, a pleasure to recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for this important hearing. We're approaching 10 hours that you've been here, and yet your impact by coming here to the People's House is so important. Mr. Wallach, I will never forget your words. I want to present a question to you. And you've presented challenges to us today. If you had to choose between the problems that we've addressed, would you look for more innovation, more accessibility, more flexibility, or more urgency in response?
Can you turn
Very
the
good, yes.
microphone on? We don't want to miss one word.
Sure. The flip answer. Yeah, the flip answer is that he would choose all of the above, but.
The most important thing to patients live today.
But the most important thing to patients alive today
They have access to pharmacy service and women to successful process.
that they have access to promising therapies that are moving through the clinical trial practice today.
We look at the European Union.
We look at what? Oh, we look at the European Union
And the conditional approval pathway.
in the conditional approval pathway.
In the fact they have a conditional approval pathway for animals in the U.S.
And that we have a conditional approval pathway for animals in the U.S., but not for human beings. It begs the question why we aren't doing everything we can to get therapies to people who are dying and to have the science, to have the chance to live to see a possible cure or cures.
Thank you for an honest and a courageous answer. I'm going to take that answer and pivot to Dr. Esham. Dr. Esham, the clinical trials process can be long and incredibly resource intensive, and especially with the delays that COVID has caused for patients in the clinical trial process, which really exacerbated what Mr. Wallach just stated, and he's nodding in affirmation of that. Are there actions that can be taken or policies enacted to redesign clinical trials to account for the interruptions that have been caused by the COVID pandemic?
Thank you for that question. We, at the very onset of the pandemic, we worked with very quickly with our member companies to continually engage with the FDA to make sure that we understood how to document any disruptions or any missing data that may have occurred due to revamping operations during the outset of the pandemic. We currently are operating under the assumption that the FDA did put out guidance very quickly and put out iterative guidance over the course of the spring and early summer. So we were operating under the assumption that that issue should not result in undue delays in programs, but that is an area that we're monitoring very closely.
Thank you for addressing what Mr. Wallach put forth. These delays are so important for these people. Time is of the essence. Time is limited. Do you feel, Dr. Esham, that there should be other steps such as allowing increased patient access, which Mr. Wallach just talked about, for investigational drugs outside of the clinical trials, and that we should be mindful of to account for the disruptions that have occurred in this pandemic?
Again, thank you for that question. And again, we are supportive of the fact that there is that expanded access is a tool in the toolbox that can, where companies can provide, can make a decision to provide that medicine, investigational medicines via expanded access. But if I may, I just want to underscore some of the other revolutions that I think are also important in the entirety of this conversation, and that is again, some of the things we learned under the pandemic, and that is how can we bring the trials, the actual clinical trials themselves, closer to the patients and in a way that reduces burdens on patients. So in addition to expanded access, I just want to make sure we're also focusing on improvements to the ability to enroll people in clinical trials based on tools and design such as decentralized trials, telehealth, all of those types of things, in addition to the expanded access conversation.
I think that innovation is so important. My time has expired, but again, thank you, Madam Chair, for this incredibly important hearing today. And thank you for being here at this late hour. I yield.
The gentleman yields back. And now the chair is pleased to recognize one of the new members to our committee and a marvelous addition to the Health Subcommittee, the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Craig, for your 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you so much, Chairwoman Eshoo. And let me just say that I am new to this committee. This is my second term in Congress, and this has been one of the most impactful subcommittee hearings, committee hearings that I've been a part of as a member. You know, I know because we meet with our constituents regularly who have devastating neurodegenerative diseases like ALS, Alzheimer's, or Huntington's, that this is just a devastating set of disease states. While I know there have been huge advancements in our research and understanding of brain illnesses, I know there are limited treatment options and absolutely no cures. I'll add that I know the impacts on families, as my own family watched my grandfather suffer with Alzheimer's for a number of years before his passing. You know, in Minnesota, we are so fortunate to have world-class healthcare systems and research centers like the ALS Clinic in Hennepin Healthcare. It's the first certified center of excellence in the state of Minnesota, and it provides ALS patients with the most cutting-edge treatments that are only available in a research setting. So your words today are incredibly important to me. Still, my constituents suffering from those illnesses and their caregivers do not have the luxury of time. And if there's anything that you have made clear to Congress here today, it's that point. I want to say to our witnesses and to those in our communities watching tonight, your message has been received by this Congress. I am so proud of the bipartisan nature of our work on these issues on this particular subcommittee. Congress, NIH, FDA, and industry, we must work together to make sure that we're doing everything we can to improve patient access to life-saving treatments and ultimately to cures. I want to start with Mr. Wallach. Just your presence here is so commended. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for sharing your story and advocating, not just for yourself, but for everyone who can't be here. I'd like to ask you, from your perspective, what do you think FDA should do better to incorporate the patient experience and perspective into their decision making?
It took FDA 6 years to write the 2019 guidance that we talked about today. So at some point in time, you begin to wonder whether the words are matched by reality. So one thing I think that FDA can do to dramatically expand the emphasis and in including patients in their processes and finding ways to actually expedite therapies. and terminal diseases. When the risk paradigm is obvious to all.
Mr. Wallach, I promise you that my team and I will make sure the FDA sees the answer that you just gave me to that question. You and all of our witnesses here tonight have really touched every single one of us. And for the pieces of legislation that you've all asked us to review, I commit that my team and I will do just that. I just want to close this out, Ms. Laddie, by giving you the last word here. We know that health disparities exist in this country, especially for Black and Brown Americans. Can you talk a little bit more about your experience and how you believe what we should focus on to begin to close this gap?
Wow, that's such an important question. I think that there has to be more money put in an effort for Black and Brown people to participate in clinical trials. I think there needs to be more outreach. I think we need better medical care. I think we need paid family leave. I think there needs to be more visibility, which is one of the reasons why I'm so committed to doing this. I think people need to see my community, both my Black and Brown community, and see us as people that are going through this disease in far higher rates than any other group. I think there needs to be more compassion and understanding. But I think that the government needs to focus on finding a cure for Alzheimer's disease. And I think by helping Black and Brown Americans, you help all Americans.
Ms. Laddie, thank you so much. And Chairwoman Eshoo, thank you for your graciousness in giving me a few extra seconds. With that, I yield back.
Anytime. And now I think we have exhausted and recognized all the members of the subcommittee, and I can recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, who is waving on to our subcommittee. You're recognized for your 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. So I've been here, I'm in my 22nd year in the Congress, unlike Angie Craig, a little bit longer. But I also feel that this is one of the most impactful hearings I've heard, and I think it could be a real game changer, the kind of intensity I hear from my colleagues. I want to say to people who are listening, you said that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are advocates and who have ALS, that I remember the AIDS epidemic, and AIDS was a death sentence also. And actually, it was a population of people, mostly gay men at first, that weren't especially popular necessarily. And yet the community organized and was out there and fighting and noisy and organized groups of supporters and partners to make things happen. And I think that you probably recruited a lot of partners, not just ALS, but all the diseases that we were talking about today. I think there's a lot more intensity of interest. I learned actually from Mr. Wallach that that MS diagnosis, that ALS is diagnosed as much as MS. Is that true?
That is true.
So my guess is also that there's more money that goes into MS. People live longer, et cetera. And it, you know, we may disagree now across the aisle, but I feel like it's because in some ways Big Pharma gets to pick winners and losers. And maybe the fact that ALS patients don't live as long it may not be as useful. However, I think the government and taxpayers, American taxpayers, put a lot of money into the research and development and trials and all that kind of thing. And hopefully, as members of Congress, we're going to be able to direct more resources and more availability and accessibility, which, as you pointed out, Mr. Wallach, I think is the most important thing, accessibility especially, as a result of what you have said today. I want to thank all of the witnesses, really. This has been quite a remarkable hearing, and the testimony has been so incredibly moving. And I mean that in the most active sense, moving. And I think that we have a lot of assignments that are out there now of what the kinds of things that we can do and that we need to do, and that you will find in a short period of time, I think, that you have really made a difference. I'd actually just like to see if you have any final words, Mr. Wallach, that you want to leave with us, or if any of the other witnesses have a brief. I've got a little over a minute left, and just a few closing comments. I'd welcome them.
I really wanted to thank the committee for this hearing, for seeing all of us, for hearing all of us.
Put your microphone on so we can hear it all.
And put it close to your mouth.
Oh, maybe I need to be
Close to your
closer.
mouth.
Right.
For hearing all of us, for seeing all of us, and for acting on all the requests we have made as advocates today. The committee, this Congress, has the chance to end diseases that were once hopeless. We hope you have the courage to see this through. And we look forward to celebrating the end of these diseases with you.
Well, thank you. I'm so proud to have you as constituents of mine. I'm honored, and I thank all of the witnesses. And we are not powerless here to make a difference and to partner with you to make them in the right direction. So thank you, Madam Chair. I really appreciate it.
Gentlewoman yields back, and last but certainly not least, we'll close out the questions of members today with the ranking member of our full committee, Ms. McMorris Rogers. Glad you could make it back. Oh.
I heard just the tail end of that, and I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for your compelling advocacy, for sharing your story. I was talking with Jan earlier. Well, she's talked to me a couple of times, actually, about this hearing and just what a long day this has been. And the fact that you made the trip, you traveled here, that's not easy, to be here and to share your story. And it is powerful. It's powerful. And we've all been impacted by you and others that have received this devastating diagnosis with ALS. And I've worked in years past, but I think this is really an opportunity for us to come together and to do what you just stated, to really make a difference. And I'm reminded again of just the tremendous research that is underway right now, and we are on the verge of amazing breakthroughs. And we need to say yes and embrace what all that can mean to so many individuals. So you represent not just yourself, but you're representing a whole bunch of other people. So thank you so much. I wanted to ask Ms. Booth too. Your family has faced a lot of challenges getting your grandfather the best care possible, and particularly at the end, given the symptoms he was experiencing. How common is it for HD patients to receive services in long-term care facilities? And how challenging is it for HD families to locate a facility that can provide the appropriate care?
Yeah, so there are actually only 10 long-term care facilities that specialize in Huntington's disease in the United States. So that's very few. And then, people are driving hundreds of miles, or so it creates, a lot of frustration. So definitely we need to work on expanding that, or also helping, with the like helping people be able to stay home and have care at home as long as possible.
Well, again, I appreciate you spending the day with us and sharing your story and advocating for so many others. I think this has been an important hearing for all of us, and I look forward to working together to continue to advance solutions that are going to improve so many lives. Thank you, Madam Chair. With that, I'll yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Well, I think that parting this week, this sweet company, I think is somewhat difficult because there's a lot of emotional tie between those of us that are seated here and you that gave the testimony today. I'm proud to have brought this hearing forward. It was highly intentional because it was really desperately needed. But you have been the stars. You have been the stars. Every member here, every member has hung on every word that you have uttered. To Miss Abruvaya, what a wife you are. What a partner you are. What a mother you are. What a citizen you are. You're a source of pride to all of us. And it's really humbling to have you come into our committee room and that you would repeat the words of your beautiful husband to the people of our country and their representatives. To you, Dr. Andrews, to all of the witnesses that were part of the second panel, thank you. You've been so instructive to us. You've taken the very real stories of your day-to-day lives, really expressing to us what, the very burdens of humanity in your personal stories, taking care of your mother, taking care of your husband, and then speaking for all of the advocates and the patients across the country. Members know that we speak for, some 750,000 people. You are speaking for millions in our country. And although this has been an extraordinarily long, drawn-out, frustrating day, and I know that you're exhausted, but none of it has been a waste of time. None of it, not 1 minute. Even the waiting is worth it, and we're going to show you that it was worth it by taking up the legislation, working together to pass it. I think that there is a rock-solid commitment here at the committee to advance this legislation, that Dr. Andrews and others, including the advocates, have said. You've been instructive to us. You've said, this is what we need. It's the right ingredients, it's the right recipe to address what is ailing us. My hope is, more than anything else, is that hope comes out of this. And I have confidence that it will. I've been around here for some time. I can feel it. It's in the air. It's here. And I think that our best work is right at hand. So as you travel home, know that you've made an enormous, extraordinary difference. Know that. All right? Bravo to you, Mr. Wallach. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I'd like to, absolutely, yay.